Welcome to St. Francis College. I want to thank Provost Houlihan, Brother Edward of the English Department, my colleagues in the English Department, the Women's Center. Where are Athena and, Dr. Athena Devlin and Dr. Emily Horowitz, Alumni Relations, and Special Events for sponsoring today's event. It is a pleasure and an honor to have Kathryn Stripling Byer here today as the inaugural poet in our new spring reading series. Byer's achievements are many, including 5 years as the first female poet laureate of North Carolina, the publication of her first collection, The Girl in the Midst of the Harvest, in the Associated Writing Program's award series, excuse me, her 10-year tenure as poet in residence at Western Carolina University, and the many publication awards you will find listed in your program. While the awards are important and well-deserved, they are not what I want to talk about today. Today, here, on the first day of spring, I want to share with you a very few, thoughts on the beauty and grace of Kathryn Stripling Byer's work and what that work has come to mean in my own life. Nearly 10 years ago, as I was starting to find my way toward a doctoral dissertation on women's poetry, my dear friend and colleague, Brother Owen Sadlier, asked me, excuse me, if I was familiar with Byer's work. I had to confess that I was not. Owen's response was to run right up and get his copy of Black Shawl so he could show me the poem Mountain Time. Up here in the mountains, we know what extinct means. We've seen how our breath on a bitter night fades like a ghost from the window glass. We know the wolf's gone, the panther, we've heard the old stories, run down, stutter out into silence. Who knows where we're heading? I was immediately smitten. There is no other way to describe my reaction. I devoured Black Shawl, then Byer's other works. Here, I thought, is a poet who speaks to me. Despite, or I like to think because of, the fact that I grew up in Maine and she grew up in Georgia, Byer's poetry strikes deep chords within me. This is not easy poetry, but that is not to say that it is too complicated or too difficult, or too anything. What I mean is that Byer's work is rewarding, that it will give as much to the reader as the reader puts into it, more even. Byer does not flinch from difficult subjects. She does not write only about the pretty and dainty. She writes about real people, often women, dealing with real life. Yet the reader is always ready to make whichever journey Byer proposes because she knows that she's in the hands of, no, that she's in the care of a generous poet, a poet who tells the reader the truth, who values beauty, who trusts her reader. Since that day, a decade ago, when I first read a Kathryn Stripling Byer poem, her work has been part of the warp and weft of my life. I have read her poetry, written about it, presented a conference paper on it, taught it, and shared it with my family and friends. Now I share it with you. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Kathryn Stripling Byer.
Thank you for coming out today. You have a warm place inside against the wind that has been pretty fierce all day long. I hope that the poetry reading will warm you up even more and you will be able to go out into the night with fortitude. Wendy and Jerry Galligan have been wonderful to me. Wendy and I have become friends via email, and when I received her email of invitation last year, I thought, what is this email from Brooklyn? I mean, what is this? And when I realized she was inviting me to leave my mountain fortress and come north to read, I was astonished and just very, very proud and honored, as I am honored today to stand here at the launch of the Women's Poetry Reading Series. I'd like to, I could thank all the wonderful people who were at dinner last night. I have used your comments, Tim Houlihan, Brother Owen, and Vanessa, where Vanessa's out there, but there's Vanessa. Your comments may very well be woven into some of mine as I weave my poems together for you today. I'd also like to welcome my nephew, Mitch Stripling, who is here with his daughters, one of whom is named Emma Kathryn Stripling, and his younger daughter, who's an elephant lover, I believe, an animal lover, Olivia Alice Stripling, and his wife, Jordan Pascoe, who is wearing the boots I wish I were wearing right now, but I decided before I came down that I'd just keep on my comfy shoes, and that way I wouldn't totter and weave around as I was reading to you. I've been, for years, entranced by the image, the metaphor of stitchery, of weaving, of quilt making. When I was raised, as I was being raised on a farm in South Georgia, I was much under the influence of the men in my family. And Mitch will understand, he understands why. My father was a strong man, a farmer who had survived the Depression, who had built a farm from practically nothing, and was just flat out stubborn. I was encouraged to go to college. No one in my family had been to college yet, and I was to make all A's. I was to be the accomplished, young woman. But when I began to write poetry, I was caught up more and more in the activities of the women in my life, especially the embroidery, the crocheting, the sewing that my grandmother did on her old treadle sewing machine. I found that really compelling, and one of the first poems I wrote when I became seriously engaged with poetry and in poetry was originally titled Women's Work. I retitled it to be Afternoon. It's in a sequence, and I think now that I look back, I thought that women's work just was too woman's workish as a title. I recall the very famous Southern poet Alan Tate telling me of a poem years ago when I was in graduate school. I had shown him one. He said, well, it's just domestic. And so it was like women's work is merely domestic and not really worthy of your attention. And I came to realize that was not true at all. That crocheting, quilt making, weaving were very much worth my attention and had been worth the attention of so many women in my life and before my life. I pull a yarn looped around my needle through a stitch and move on to another. Single crochet is what they call it, and for larger stitches there are more loops you must gather and control. You've double, treble, double, treble crochet as the stitches hook into a sweater or a shawl, or what's more common, rippled afghans if you're patient. Making something out of almost nothing, some new pattern from a ball of yarn takes hours, days, takes dawn till dark. My mother did it, and her mother, and her mother's mother fashioned doilies out of thin white thread while I looked on. She said such fingerwork calmed women's nerves by making them take pains to pass the time. It's true the chains link up so quickly you may hardly notice when it's time to turn. All afternoon I pull yarn looped around my needle through these countless stitches cradled in my arms. Well, I had an interesting comment made about my first book of poems in which this poem appears, that I was making links in the chain that is both our bondage and empowerment. And I've thought about that over the years, how bondage has certainly been part of so many women's daily lives, men too for that matter. But then the empowerment that can come from creative use of that bondage to really step right into the world of it, the tension of it, well, it takes guts, it takes imagination, it takes faith. And when I moved from South Georgia up to the mountains of western North Carolina, I found women who were still making things like that. They were still sewing, they were still stitching, they were weaving, they were making quilts. One of those women was named Delphia Potts, and I'm going to introduce you to her in this poem titled Delphia. She had two daughters who were close friends of mine, and I never learned to quilt. So, I mean, quilting was a new thing to me. I really didn't much know what to make of it, except that the women were in western North Carolina were passionate about it. Delphia told them the truth early on. When they started to play around her quilting frame, holding what she had decreed would be Cullowhee Valley's most bountiful rose garden. What keeps the whole blooming patchwork from falling to pieces is stitches no bigger than pinpricks, she told them. So fasten your calicos steady by mites, and they'll hold till the last of you lies dreaming under these pretty scraps. Don't let light waning just before supper time hurry you into a tangle you'll have to pick out with your fingernails. Ever pick corn silk from out of the shucked nubs, you'll know what I mean. Just remember the light will come back. For another day's labor, you'll wait to see pine needles pressed against window glass, glory vines cascading this way and that, and you'll know what you want is a pattern that makes of this world more than fleur-de-lis, goose-wing, and water-wheel, bounded by what I remember a neighbor called worm border, though I myself prefer snail creep or dog trail. Don't ask me the big questions none but a fool tries to answer straight. All I can tell you of why you were born is to take your own time once the needle's been threaded, the stray thimble fetched from the cloth bag. Come closer, and I'll swing the gate to my ring-around rose garden. I'll show you cross and crown, bluebirds. I'll show you the rainbow, stepping stones, dove in the window, the winding way. What are you waiting for? Sit down, sit down. Oh, the names of those quilt patterns just always brings chills to my flesh. I love them. I love the poetry in them and the poetry of the image of women sitting around a cloth frame with Willa Mae and Annie Lee, the two daughters, playing underneath and learning to quilt just from being there, watching their mother, and I'm sure being taught by her, but she was an amazing woman. She turns up again in a poem that Dr. Galligan quoted, read a few lines from in her introduction. This is an inaugural poem of sorts of a bookstore in Sylva, North Carolina, which is, you know, it's a nice little town. It's not Asheville or Atlanta or, you know, but it's a nice town, and we have a really good bookstore there named City Lights. We have our own City Lights. So when the bookstore opened, my good friend asked me to write a poem for the event. We were led through down Main Street with bagpipes playing. It was a really festive, fun, rather spine-tingling event. This was also around the time of the millennium, when the millennium was to arrive and everything was going to be destroyed. Where the planes would fall from the sky, all the computers in the world would go blotto, and we were all supposed to be terribly terrified of it. But I remember that my nephew said, it's not going to happen. He knew computers, so he figured this was just all kind of a big media freak out show, and I think he was obviously right. But it takes all of this poem is trying to pull all of that in, this particular time of turning into the new millennium. It's mountain time. News travels slowly up here in the mountains. Our narrow roads twisting for days, maybe years, till we get where we're going, if we ever do. Even if some lonesome message should make it through Deep Gap or the fastness of Thunderhead, we're not obliged to believe it's true, are we? Consider the famous poet minding her post at the Library of Congress, who shrugged off the question of what we'd be reading at century's end. By the year 2000, nobody will be reading poems. Thus she prophesied. End of that interview. End of the world as we know it. Yet how can I fault her despair, doing time as she was in a crumbling capital? Sirens and gunfire the nights long, the Pentagon's stockpile of weapons stacked higher and higher. No wonder the books stacked around her began to seem relics. No wonder she dreamed her own bones dug up years later, tagged in a museum somewhere in the Midwest. American poet, extinct species. Up here in the mountains, we know what extinct means. We've seen how our breath on a bitter night fades like a ghost from the window glass. We know the wolf's gone, the panther. We've heard the old stories run down, stutter out into silence. Who knows where we're heading? All roads seem to lead to millennium, dark roads with drop-offs we can't plumb. It's time to be brought up short now with the tale tellers. Listen. There once lived a woman named Delphia who walked through these hills teaching children to read. She was known as a quilter whose hand never wearied, a mother who raised up 2 daughters to pass on her words like a strong chain of stitches. Imagine her sitting among us, her quick thimble moving along these lines as if to hear every word striking true as the stab of her needle through calico. While prophets discourse about endings, don't you think she'd tell us the world as we know it keeps calling us back to beginnings? This labor to make our words matter is what any good quilter teaches. A stitch in time, let's say, a blind stitch that clings to the edges of what's left, the ripped scraps and remnants, whatever won't stop taking shape even though the whole crazy quilt's falling to pieces. And it seems as if so often, doesn't it, that the whole crazy quilt is falling to pieces. That what can we do about it but keep laboring at what we love, and keep making those stitches and strong stitches to hold fast. I was thinking of that this morning, remembering that this is also the anniversary, in addition to being the first day of spring, the anniversary of the Iraq invasion, our invasion of Iraq. And I wanted to, let me have a little sip. I'm always afraid I'll just pour it right down my garment, which I've done before. But not today. Thank goodness. I know you're glad, Wendy, that I embarrass you and me by pouring water all over myself. That doesn't happen to any of you, does it? I'm sure that just never has happened in the classroom or wherever. This is a poem that takes off from a poem by Mirza Ghalib that was translated by W.S. Merwin some years ago. The epigraph is "Charred dove, nightingale still burning." I began this poem on a drive home from Eastern North Carolina, Barton College. Evie Shockley, wonderful poet Evie Shockley, who is sitting on the front row, would know where that is. And on the drive back from this Women's Writers Conference, which was titled Women Writing Place, there is an article in the Raleigh newspaper about the bombing of a residential area in Baghdad, and a mother coming upon the body of her daughter, and the daughter had been decapitated, basically. It's a horrible thing to read. And I thought of my own daughter, safe in Austin, Texas, at that moment, studying Urdu at the University of Texas and preparing to stand up and recite in Urdu a poem by Mirza Ghalib. And title is Her Daughter. 4 years younger than mine, her daughter lies under the rubble. She stands at the edge of it, watching the men lifting one stone, another, till out of the crater they gently lift somebody's body, a body she now sees is female. She tries to recall what her daughter was wearing, but no scrap of clothing remains on it. Whose body is it? She sees no face, she sees no head. At the edge of the crater she stands while they swaddle the body in blankets. A neighbor has brought. Through the blasted streets she calls a name that gets lost in the rattle of gunfire, a name no one hears as they pull from the rubble her daughter's head, hair twisted round like a root wad, not blonde like my daughter's, not waking up as my daughter will be, being safe on this morning in Texas, beginning to brush her hair after her shower, her face in the mirror as perfect as always I see it, the fair skin she wishes had South Asian dusk in it, not southern sun from the fields of her mother's line. As she examines the scar on her temple, the chin, she believes, looks not quite smooth enough, while her fingers scroll over its surface as if they are translating Urdu, word after unsteady word of a ghazal that she must recite today, all the while fearing her voice will fail, even as she tries to fill up the silence with Ghalib's desire to see, lost in the blaze of the mirror that holds her, the face of the beloved. Now, if you have read any of Ghalib's or Rumi's, any of these poets from that poetic tradition, you know that the beloved is a somewhat ambiguous term. Is it God? Is it an actual beloved? And finally, what does it matter? It is the beloved. It is the most loved. It is what you aspire toward, to become one with, to connect with. And so that poem was hard. That was a hard poem to write, really, really emotionally hard. This one was just fun. Sort of hard, but fun. It's called Precious Little, and it takes a quote from Eudora Welty. Eudora Welty is, one of the female pantheon of Southern women fiction writers. Yeah, I see a fan out there. Flannery O'Connor, Kathryn Ann Porter, the triumvirate of Southern women writers. And I fell in love with Eudora Welty's stories early on, and if you've not read any of her work, I think you just really, really enjoy them, the language of them, the humor of them. The quote I'm using is from Losing Battles, a novel, a long novel that she wrote near the end of her life. The passageway down which they had just gone was bright as the eye of a needle. So here we are again, stitchery, needles, thread, and so you can see how fascinated I am still by that. But the thought of the difficulty and the biblical reference to passing through the eye of the needle resonated very strongly with me too. Now you women teachers out here and women students, I bet you're going to I think you'll probably maybe recognize the scene in this poem, said at a writers' conference. So we'd gathered to talk about writing, remembering great ones who'd recently gone from our midst and the various ways they had followed each voice through the needle's eye into the clearing of art. When a novelist slouched on the front row opined that the only real subject is battle and how men survive it. I seethed while my student poets, all of them women, sat waiting for someone to challenge his vision of literature. Belligerent canon where warring tribes battle it out in their epics and blood-spattered novels. Miss Welty, I countered, stayed clear of the battlefield, if you recall. She sat down every day at the same desk and made language raise the world up from the grave of our common amnesia. He barely acknowledged my comment. He wanted to flirt with my students. He shrugged at me, stood up, and showed off the fit of his tight jeans. My God, what a chasm he opened up right then between us. We stared like combatants across the trench, loading our weapons, his now on full frontal display, along with the first novel already lobbed to reviewers by Random House. As for me, middle-aged poet, what were mine? Precious little. The shot I recall of having seen months ago of a woman my age holding up to the camera a photo of daughter or sister or good friend who disappeared into the rubble of felled towers. The same woman I had seen sifting through ruins in Fallujah and Kabul, even now cringing when she hears the gunfire in Baghdad. A woman who stares back at me when I'm dusting my daughter's face framed on the shelf, smiling out at a day that's been gone for so long I can barely remember it. Nothing much going on, no bombs, no fireworks, just late summer afternoon and the dogs asleep under the oak tree. Oh, paradise. No bombs, and certainly no fireworks. We had neighbors who would, on the 4th, would shoot off horrible fireworks, and I would get so angry I'd call the sheriff and have him come tell them to keep it down. And they did. I mean, that's okay. They're gone now, those neighbors. They're gone, along with their heavy, heavy-duty rock music. Can you believe how loud rock music can be? I mean, our house shook. It's truly amazing, and it shows how old I've gotten too, that I am bothered by rock music. So much of what women, so much of what Southerners, white Southerners, Black Southerners, Latino and Latina Southerners, all of us, all the tribes of us in this country, so much of our stories are still underground. And our responsibility, our joy, our calling, I believe, as writers and as a people, our calling is to unearth as many of those stories as they can out there among us or within us. And those within us are often the hardest to unearth and to discover. But, I quote, and I think so often of my Southern roots, being rooted in a place as I have been for so much of my life. I've thought often of Mary Oliver's, a wonderful poet, Mary Oliver. I'm sure most of you know her work. Her comment that perhaps the root is the flower, the blossom of that other life. And so if you think of the roots, your roots as blossoms of that other life, that other story, that otherness out there that's calling to you and within you, it kind of changes your perspective a bit, I think, about place, about what we take as our stories. I want to shift now to my new book, which I have fallen absolutely in love with. It's such a gorgeous book. It's a book that's tried to take on some of my more difficult subjects and their voices. But let me lead into that with a poem from a section titled Drought Days. Growing up on a farm, we were always worried about the weather. I mean, we still are, for that matter. But drought was always something we feared, and we have been having terrible droughts and then terrible floods. In the summer, when I would be visiting my grandmother, we would, my cousins and I, fill up oil cans. Do you know what I'm talking about? Those huge oil drums with water, put on our bathing suits and climb in. This was what, instead of going to the beach, this is what we did. And we would have our transistor radio, and whatever we talked about, we seemed to enjoy it well enough. This is about being there at that time in my life. When the pond dried up, my cousins and I filled oil drums with my grandfather's hoses and pulled on our bathing suits, climbed in like daughters of lawyers or bankers, and stood there pretending we dawdled at Myrtle Beach or Sanibel Island. The clouds passing over might that very morning have darkened the boardwalk in Panama City. Her white leghorn scratched in the sand, his pigs wallowed. The water began to smell rusty, more tractor oil to it than tropical coconut. We hauled ourselves out feeling silly and shriveled, our skin flecked with rust, knowing we were still stuck on the farm. We would always be hicks, pink and flabby like pickled pig flesh in our grandmother's jars. Soul food, I grew up to hear it called, as if the collards and side meat we set on our table had been sanctified, but by stories we knew were not ours, in which we were no more than bystanders and not always innocent ones. And so I began trying to write about the racial unrest during the 60s when I was in high school. I tried to do it for years. I couldn't. I could not do it. It had no structure, it had no rhythm. It was an outpouring of rage, of shame, any number of other emotions. It just wasn't any good. And if you're going to try to write about a subject that powerful, that profound and important to you, you want it to be good. You know, you really want it to be about the best you can do. So I had to break an ankle to do it, falling in the Smokies on a hike and being rescued by a number of rangers, park rangers, who carried me out on a litter. I mean, it was very dramatic and worthy of a movie, I'll have to say. I couldn't believe I'd ended up in that situation. Stupidly ended up that way. For 8 weeks, I sat on a couch in a cast, and I read, and I started writing sonnets about this. The sonnet form gave me the control I needed. It gave me the direction I needed. It gave me the weight of words that I needed when I needed them. And I'd like to share several of them from the sequence titled Southern Fictions. The quote from Thomas Tranströmer that begins this section of the book runs, this is a portion of it. I inherited a dark wood, and as I was writing these poems, I felt that I had indeed inherited a dark wood, and I was trying to find my way through that. My father drapes his battle flag across a backroom window. If I tried to tell him why I wish he wouldn't, I'd have hell to pay, or else I'd end up sounding crass and smug. It's just not worth it. Let it pass. I squelch my fury at this flag and all it means, the stubbornness, the pride, the gall of my own people trying hard to pass the buck, as if what happened never did exactly, or even if it did, it doesn't mean what they think. Something awful, racist swill, and all that liberal junk. I know the truth hid out those days in silence, but what does it mean, this flag? Refusal to admit our guilt? I don't know. I still can't get it right, the way those dirt roads cut across the flats and led to shacks where hounds and muddy shoats skulked roundabout. Describing it sounds trite as hell, the good old South I love to hate. The truth, what's that? How should I know? I stayed inside too much. I learned to boast of stupid things. I kept my ears shut tight as we kept doors locked, windows locked, the curtains drawn. Now I know why. The dark could hide things from us. Dark could see while we could not. Sometimes those dirt roads shocked me where they ended up. I watched a dog die in the ditch. The man who shot him winked at me. I could tell you about some bumper stickers that I've seen on my drive home to Georgia at times. I was telling Professor Houlihan's class about them, but I will not do that right now. These linked sonnets that I'm going to read to you are about the incident that set all of this going. These poems and just the whole situation down in my neck of Southwest Georgia. I don't know if you remember Shirley Sherrod, the woman who was trashed by Andrew Breitbart, the right-wing conservative blogger, op-eder, or whatever. He was an angry man, obviously, and he had accused her of being racist when in fact her speech to the NAACP in South Georgia was anything but that. The video had been edited to make her sound racist. Her father was murdered in Baker County, just a few miles over the Flint River, which is the river near the farm where I was raised. And I remember that. I remember that from my teenage years. There was a whole bunch then of marches, people coming down from Atlanta to protest, and after all of that had, we thought, subsided, this incident happened. While good old boys lit out with baseball bats, I dawdled in the bathroom, staring at my face a long time in the mirror. Saw no trace of beauty there, so counted zits. Sighed. That was that. Another self-examination, the last of that day, as it turned out. My father's place was empty at the table. My mother paced the kitchen, and we worried until half past when we heard his pickup churning over ruts. He slammed the door too hard. He walked too slow. We watched him mouthing words we couldn't hear. When he came in, he said nobody had the guts to say go home. He shook his head and told how those boys with their bats had bullied blacks clear to the county line, yelling, "Don't come back again." My father drove home, in his head the words he might have said. They aren't bad boys, he told us, just misguided. The right tack to have taken would be father-like and ask them if they knew what they had done. Instead, he'd not said anything. He picked at bread set out for sandwiches. The black girl come to clean house stood outside calling, "Here I am." We pitched our voices low and changed the subject, cleared the table, let her in. My father sat there for the longest time, still brooding. That was 40 years ago. I wait. This story isn't finished yet. And one more. Are you familiar with Robin Morgan's work? Feminist poet and essayist. I invited her down to our university to read, and she was wonderful. Just absolutely wonderful. I picked her up at the airport, which I'm already telling you the poem, so let me shut up and read the poem. Don't you just, when, poets, these writers, this is how it all happened, when you just want them to read what it is there that they need to say to you. When the feminist poet flew down from New York, I drove her to campus, an hour's easy drive. We chatted all the way there, mostly politics. I liked her so much I shored up my courage and told her the work those boys had done. The macho way they bragged, how no one had the nerve to say, "Shut up." She misinterpreted my words, assuming I had suffered in the midst of bigotry, silently doing my very best to row against the tide. It sounded so good I kept quiet, ashamed to say I'd been no activist, that I'd done nothing, joined no protests, felt no guilt, had seen no reason why I should. Well, thank you for allowing me to move through those sonnets. They're not really easy for me to read, to be honest with you, but it was important to try to say as well as I could that particular time in my life. I'm going to read just a few more poems and have you ask me some questions, but I want to lighten things up a little bit now and turn to the third section, which takes the Thomas Transtromer quote, "I inherited a dark wood, but today I'm walking in the other wood, the light one." And this is for my brother, with whom I picked blackberries in the summer in South Georgia. And it was an interesting experience picking blackberries with my brother. Blackberry Road, not Tobacco Road, mind you, Blackberry Road. Piney woods where we played Fort Apache oozed rosin. Cow pies baked in the dog day heat while we picked what our mama had promised she'd turn into cobblers come supper time. Braving those thorny hells, we risked an arm, then a leg, half a torso, till trapped we stood stubborn as martyrs a while before we pulled our mortal flesh free, praying hard not to spill what we'd gathered. By then it was noon, and so hot we lost faith and walked home, scratching bug bites and snag wounds, displaying our blackberries domed in the pot, the way church deacons hoisted collection plates while we sang Gloria Patri. The gnats smelled us coming and haloed our heads when we reached the backyard where, splayed in the cool dirt, they dug under lantana bushes. Our daddy's hounds snored like the back pews each Sunday before benediction. Oh. One of our dearest family friends snored, just snored. I mean, as soon as the sermon began, the snoring began. I'm going to stay in church if that's okay. I was raised a Presbyterian. My great-grandmother was Presbyterian after she switched over from being a Pentecostalist minister up in the Dakotas, and was taken in by the Presbyterian Church, where she carried her 7 or 8 male members of her little church, and she's standing there in one of the photographs I have of her, and these men are all kind of standing there like, whatever you want us to do, we will do. So they followed her into the Presbyterian Church, and she therefore became a Presbyterian, as did the rest of her line on down to me and my brother, first Presbyterian. Sitting in church every Sunday, I hated the hats I had to wear. They were small things with net attached or hard plastic fruit. They did not fit, and sometimes they fell into the aisle or my lap if my mother had not pierced their velveteen skins with hat pins she wove through my stiff hair-sprayed hair. There was no way to scratch my small soul through those hats. No way I could sit through the sermons if not daydreaming out of them, using the blank wall beside the piano as movie screen, imagining myself hatless, free of my hairspray and beehive, my hair grown miraculously long, trailing hat pins across the small town, heading north toward what soon would be interstate. What happened next? Let us pray, said the preacher, and I came awake, though I shut my eyes dutifully. What was he saying that I should heed? Who was this God who knew everything? Why should I pull on a girdle and hose for his sake and sit waiting for him to call? Just as I am, we sang, closing the service. My soul took a deep breath and walked out. Oh. Let me close with another stitchery poem. This is a new one, a new poem that appeared in Southern Poetry Review recently. I actually was working on this, Mitch, when I came for your wedding. I was fiddling around with this poem even then. And once again, it is about the work that women do, making stitches, making links in the chain that is our bondage and our empowerment, and finally, I think, our celebration of being here in the moment in these lives. Heirloom. We never doubted the hoop in which we cast our stories would hold fast. The stitches we made last as long as we held the cloth steady. Not once did we heed the underside whereon the knots gnarled their own story. nubby as scars from a wound or a welt left behind by a switch. We never doubted our own fingers threading the tendrils of mercerized cotton through steel eyes, each licked tip we pushed through as small as the lint we launched into the bedrooms when we shook the weathered chenille, settling itself on the carpet like dandruff. Our mothers would scrape from our scalps every dusk with such ruthless care we could hear the Big Dipper ringing the night's bucket. No lice, not even the tiniest nit. Thankful we sank into feather beds, blessing each other, the chickens and mules, even sows at the trough, knowing we had been scrubbed clean as ever we would be, our nails clipped, our noses blown, every black signet of dirt pried from under our fingernails, the window fans blowing their currents down passageways hummed like the treadle of God, stitching what we called home, the earth, drawing over us its heirloom of dust. Thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear from you.